expert, Rochelle. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
It's so fantastic. We've been Twitter friends for many years.
Right. It's really great to have this chance to talk directly, right?
Yeah, no, it's really fun. We've never met before in person, but virtually meeting today. So really excited to hear all of your insights. Do you want to briefly introduce yourself?
Certainly. So I'm originally from the United States and had started studying Japanese in college and then lived and worked in Japan at a Japanese company where I encountered the great differences in how organizations work and how people communicate. And I got really fascinated by how people from Japan and other countries can bridge cultural differences and work together effectively. So I've basically made that the focus for my career.
That's awesome. And of course, your work life has been severely impacted because you were going back and forth between America and Japan.
Right. So so getting a break from those intercontinental plane trips, right? And it's very strange to have not been on a plane for such a long period of time, right?
Because you're often in San Francisco, California area, is it?
Right. That's my U.S. base. My U.S. base is San Francisco. My Japan base is Fukuoka.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, because most people expect you to be in Tokyo with all the work that you're doing with consulting, but Fukuoka is a great hub.
I definitely pop up to Tokyo really, really frequently, and that's a convenient thing about Fukuoka because I can be at the airport in 20 minutes. It's really from where I live, so yeah.
And I bet you kind of enjoy being in Fukuoka now as we're doing more stay at home, right?
Well, it's a nice place to stay at home. It's really quiet. I like my apartment. So that's important, right?
Yeah, that's really important. Let's dive right in because I think we've got a lot to talk about. Let's start with some of your topics. Now, I know you from English Twitter, but a lot of people know you from your Japanese Twitter. Here's your profile. You have so many followers. It's amazing.
I've definitely been putting a lot of effort into my Japanese Twitter, and I have great conversations with people there. Sometimes arguments too, or debates, but sometimes some controversial things I've touched on. But I learned so much from my Japanese Twitter followers. It's wonderful.
Yeah, and you often go back and forth, telling us things that are happening on the Japanese side.
And vice versa, too.
And vice versa, yeah.
I'll tell the Japanese Twitter followers, hey, this is what the foreigners are talking about. Is this really what's going on? Right? So I can kind of get the inside scoop.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, sometimes I'll share with American followers, I'm hearing this on Japanese Twitter. I'm surprised by this, or you should know about this, or this is interesting, right?
Yeah, this is one that you wrote about the corona, the New York Times article. Do you want to comment on that?
Oh, yes, certainly. So there was this very interesting New York Times article the other day that basically said that this thing is not going to end anytime soon and that we're going to need to be prepared for this going on for a long time. And so I often share with my Japanese Twitter followers things that I've found interesting in U.S. or other global news, or tweets that I've seen in English that I think that would be interesting for them as a reference, and maybe some different information than they're getting from the Japanese media. And I thought this story about was kind of shocking to me to read the expert predictions of just how long this unstable situation might last. And I thought that was something my followers would probably be interested to think about.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, I'm just adjusting the title right now. I still have the title from yesterday, so the title should change for everyone. This is not Talking with Alex Bradshaw. I'm really sorry, everybody, for that problem. We are talking with Rochelle Kopp right now today. Thank you, Rochelle. Should we dive into the obstacles and the telecommuting topic? You sent me some
Certainly. Yes, I'd be happy to talk about that. one of the things I've been tweeting about a lot and that I've been consulting a lot with my clients about recently is this whole dramatic shift that we've had to make to telecommuting in Japan. Well, telecommuting and telecommunicating, right, is a big part of it.
And telework, telecommunicating, there's so many words for it. Working from home. So
many words for it, right? And when telework is not really the standard thing that we say in English, but it's become the standard thing that's said in Japan. So I tend to, and it's much easier to say than telecommuting. So I actually kind of like it as a word. But the thing that I think is so interesting is that in Japan, very few people had the experience of telecommuting. Very few companies, less than 20% prior to the coronavirus, let people work at home, right? So it's not something that's very familiar to most Japanese companies and most Japanese employees. And so that raises a couple of questions. And the first one is, why did Japanese companies not allow telecommuting before the coronavirus? Because the equivalent figure for the United States was, over 70% of companies would allow some sort of telecommuting.
So the adjustment was a lot easier for them to work from home, right?
It was a lot more natural in the United States, where people were used to the concept and were more set up to do it. For Japanese companies, for so many companies, it was venturing into the complete unknown, right? And so then the question is, why? Why did Japanese companies not want to telecommute before the coronavirus? And so I've got this really great information here. One of the Japanese ministries actually did a survey of people. And these are the results why there's obstacles to telecommunicating firms. I keep saying telecommunicating. I mean telecommuting. I should just say telework, right?
It's so hard, that word. Yeah.
It's so hard.
Work from home, whatever you're comfortable with.
Right, exactly. So anyways, the first key thing, which I just thought was so fascinating, is that the biggest reason is that there's no policy to cover it. Japanese organizations are very rule and policy driven. And that's part of an emphasis on fairness, which is very, very strong in Japanese workplace culture.
Right, yeah.
So if you don't have a policy, if you don't have rules for doing something, you can't do it.
Yeah.
People just get paralyzed, right? And so that's becomes a really, really huge barrier. And that's actually been coming up now for some firms, of those firms where people are still having to go into work. Mm-hmm. In some cases, it's because, the company doesn't have a policy for it, so it doesn't have a way of organizationally dealing with it.
Right, yeah.
Right.
You wrote an article recently for the Japan Times, which I was going to bring up later, but it's very connected to this, on the difference in conceptualization of working from home and how some foreign staff were, of course, really upset about having to be forced to go in to work in the office.
Right. And I think what's kind of underlying the basic expectation there is for example, I'm from the US, and from an American perspective, when something unexpected or unprecedented, like the coronavirus, comes up, we are very comfortable with ad hoc solutions. And a manager will just say, I want you all to stay home and we'll just do it, right?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of in the manager's prerogative to do that. But it's also considered okay in American culture just to kind of make things up as you go along. Mm-hmm. In Japanese corporate culture, managers don't feel like they have that kind of autonomy or control or ability to decide. And doing things ad hoc is not considered okay. The things need to be done according to rules. Mm-hmm. And so then if you don't have rules, you can't do anything. So there's a huge difference. But I think a lot of the non-Japanese that I talked to when I was writing that article were very frustrated because they would like to have seen a more flexible approach. Mm-hmm. But that's just not the strong suit of Japanese organizations.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a big kind of fundamental value difference there, I think. Or expectation difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I I think you've touched on so many important work culture topics, and this was your most recent one, but you also talked about the Jinji-do.
Jinji-do, yes.
Yeah. Which is a huge issue in Japan, shuffling the work stuff. And recently you were talking about it on Twitter, and I picked up on that. You want to comment on that issue?
Certainly. So this is one of my pet peeves for a long time about Japanese business culture, is that Japanese organizations have this tradition of periodically rotating staff. Mm-hmm. And they will rotate people quite broadly in the organization, sometimes to completely unrelated business areas. So the idea behind this is to have each employee get exposure to many facets of the business. It's almost as if they were training each employee so that they could become president of the firm one day. Now, whereas all this exposure can be really great learning experience and does make people well-rounded, and it's a way to get some variety for people when you're working for the same company your entire career. The problem is that in today's world, jobs are more specialized.
Yep.
And require more professional expertise.
Yep.
And so when you're moving people around so rapidly, they don't build up that expertise. And so you get a lot of people who are very amateurish in their approach.
I've heard a lot of people say it's to stop corruption. It's to stop favoritism, right?
Right, exactly. And I used to work for a Japanese bank, and so there they would really move people around. And the idea is if they had someone in, for example, working for one certain branch for too long, that they might get really, really cozy with the customers, and then over time start to do things that were untoward. Okay, so from my perspective as a management consultant, a management professor, my view on that would be if you're moving people around to prevent fraud, that means that you have really bad internal controls.
Yeah.
In other words, there's a heck of a lot of other better ways to prevent fraud than moving people around and disrupting everything. So I feel like, frankly, that's kind of a really lame excuse.
Yeah.
But that's become the accepted explanation for it.
But we also know that, I mean, especially you know that in business culture or any situation in Japan, connections and knowing people over time and trusting people over time is so valuable and so important.
It's really, really important in Japanese culture. So the fact that organizations would, sort of break that is very unfortunate. The other place where I see this come up is, as I said, my U.S. base is Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley is also another culture that's very relationship driven. A lot of it is about who you know. And so when Japanese companies are rotating their Silicon Valley staff in and out every few years, each person then has to come in and rebuild their network.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Rebuild their network, and they never get deeply rooted. And then they wonder why they're not being viewed as insiders for deal flow and things like that, right? Yeah. So it's a big issue.
And then quite often you'll have this big reshuffle, and then people will be frantically calling back to the person who knew how to do something and asking for help. And everybody's under so much stress. I think in your article you talk about all the stress it puts on everybody and how it might be connected to the lack of children being born in this country.
I think all these things do in many ways play into that. If you're under stress and you're working too many hours and you're physically located away from your family, because that's what happens in a lot of these reassignments, or in some cases, for example, Japanese school systems also move people around, and someone will be moved to the other end of the school system, and then they have this horrible commute. If you're not physically living in the same house as your spouse, or if you are living in the same house but you're working crazy hours, it's going to affect your opportunity to procreate. It's just,
definitely.
I mean, it's just a sort of a fact, right?
Plus, you're raising a whole new generation of kids who don't know both parents.
Yes, exactly. So this is a problem in general with the long working hours in Japan, but the moving people around to different places so they have to live away from home just is another layer that exacerbates it, right?
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned Silicon Valley, and just a good time to bring up your book, Valley Speak.
Oh, sure.
I love that so much. I just came across it when I was preparing for this interview. Can you introduce that a little bit?
Certainly. So what had happened is it's sort of an interesting story. I had done a book a while ago about U.S. business buzzwords for the Japanese. And I've got a friend who's this kind of Japanese book publishing guru, and once in a while I stop by and do aisatsu and say hello to him. And I bring my latest book. And he looks at it with his expert eye and he says, well, Rochelle, you're in Silicon Valley. There really ought to be a book like this just focused on Silicon Valley vocabulary, because all these Japanese go to Silicon Valley and they don't know what the heck people are talking about. It's like another language. And of course, this is why this guy is a famous books consultant. And I'm like, yeah, that's a really great idea. So I got out of the meeting and I immediately called up the publisher and I said, hey, I was talking to such and such son, and he had this great idea. Do you want to do it? And they're like, yeah, go ahead. And so I started work on a Silicon Valley vocabulary book for Japanese. And I'd already had some lists and things that I had made for my clients myself. But as I started to do research for it, I realized there was no book like this in English.
Right, yeah.
I thought I really ought to do an English version too. And at that time, that was right when the television series Silicon Valley had started.
Oh, yeah. So a lot of the slangs came out in the series as well.
All the slang came out in the series, and there were people on Twitter who were like, what is such and such, or what's a programmer, or what's a down round? And people weren't getting it. And I thought, well, Silicon Valley viewers are going to need something too. And I do know that 3 different writers for the series have the book. We got the book into their hands.
That's
so
great.
They were using it as reference while writing it. But that was part of the inspiration as well. Because I was thinking about it, and then with some friends had binge watched the first season.
Oh, that's so fun.
People are going to need this in English too.
Yeah. So
then I had a whole adventure with Kickstarting and self-publishing. It was really quite interesting.
Yeah, that's an awesome background to have as well. Kickstarter and self-publishing and self-funding is a big part of the startup community, right?
Exactly. I had really wanted to try Kickstarter. It was very interesting to kind of just see how these things work, right? So, yeah.
So you wrote 2 books in English, is that right? The Lowdown and Valley Speak.
And I have another one, which is my original book from years ago, The Rice Paper Ceiling, Breaking Through Japanese Corporate Culture.
Yeah.
And what I really need to do is I need to reissue that. The thing is, I wrote it over 20 years ago, but it's basically very little has changed. So what I'm planning to do is republish it and then have after each chapter kind of an update as to what's different or what's the same.
Okay.
So it's just on my long list of things to do that I haven't done yet. But.
I mean, you're so busy and you're writing lots of great articles for Japan Times. You're doing lots of seminars. These are the Japanese books that you've written.
Those are some of my Japanese books. Yes.
Are you?
So I
writing it in yourself?
I do a lot of books in Japanese. Yeah.
So would you say your audience is more the Japanese audience trying to integrate with international businesses or international workers, or is your audience the Americans, or is it really a balance?
It's really a balance. It's really both. And so I would say in the consulting work that my firm does, it's probably about 50-50 work for Japanese audiences and work for non-Japanese audiences. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would say just in my publishing that there's not that many publishers anymore who are interested in publishing things on Japan.
Oh, really?
Whereas there's lots of Japanese readers who want to read about other countries and how to deal with people from other countries. So there's kind of more of a market for my writing in Japanese. So that's why there's more books in that language.
Right. Well, your most recent one, I think, is Gaikokujin to no Hataraki Kata. Is that right?
In
yeah. The manga
yes,
one?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was such a fun project. So you want me to tell you the backstory
yes,
on that one?
Yes, please.
Okay, so this genre of manga de wakaru, learn through manga, is a thing in Japanese publishing. You can find a learn whatever topic you think of through manga book out there. They're very, very popular. And a Japanese publisher approached me and said, hey, could you do this intercultural stuff, do it in a manga form? And I thought, wow, that sounds like so much fun. What a brilliant idea. Then the problem was, I sat down to write it. And when you do a manga book like this, what you have to do is you have to plot out the storyline. And I quickly realized that I am not a good fiction writer. I mean, I've done 37 books in nonfiction, but I could not. I came up with the first chapter with the story, and I turned it in the publisher, and they're like, yeah, can you try again? And
so this is fiction, then?
It's a story. It has a fictional story. And so the three people you see there are the main characters in the story.
Okay.
So that's in the front is Aoi, who is a young Japanese employee. She speaks English fairly well from learning it in school, but she's never actually worked closely with foreigners.
Okay.
And she gets transferred into the international department. The man in the back is her boss, who's an American. And then the gal behind her is kind of her senpai, a Japanese woman who's had more global experience and gives her advice. And so the story is her kind of trials and tribulations as she tries to figure out how to deal with her non-Japanese colleagues, making kind of like every mistake in the book, right? Well, in a very charming and humorous way.
But that's a great guide and a great way to tap into a younger audience. Did you
Exactly. It taps into a younger audience. And so what happened is when I could not write the fiction, I ended up putting it aside. And then I got an email from the editor who said, I'm quitting the publisher. Are you ever going to write this book? Do you want me to put it with the stuff I'm passing on to my successor or not? And I said, yeah, I know. I've been putting it off. But I had an idea. I said, I think I need a co-author who can do fiction. And I had met this gal named Madoka Chiyoda, who works for Microsoft, one of my clients. And her hobby is writing manga. And so she kind of knows how to storyboard things, or she knows about manga. And she's actually very similar to the main character in the book, because she's a young Japanese woman who had studied English in college and now all of a sudden is working with an American boss and trying to get used to that. So they always talk about write about what you know.
Yeah, definitely.
And so she's very much like the main character. She's very funny. She has a great sense of humor. Yeah. And so I said, hey, Madoka, this is a crazy idea, but do you want to write a book together? And she's like, yeah, I'm up for it. So that's what we did.
That's awesome.
She storyboarded all of the manga so that when it was handed over to the artist to do it, I mean, they just reproduced her storyboard. I mean, she did like half their work for them. It was pretty impressive.
Well,
she's very talented.
What you said about what you know, that's so important, but also what you did, hiring and collaborating with people who know a genre you're not familiar with, that's also a really great tip for anyone struggling to do it all. And I think for women in work, in business, we often struggle with that, right?
That is so true, because that's what I did when I started it. I'm like, I have to do all this myself. And then I couldn't. When I realized, hey, I could find someone who's complementary. And so it worked out really well for this book because Madoka had the experience herself. But a lot of, we sat in hours in coffee shops working on this, and she would talk about experience, and I would share, well, culturally, here's what's happening. That's awesome. I did for each manga, I did a little essay giving advice. And so it was like a really great balance. And one of the people who read it tweeted, well, this is the the combination I was waiting for. It's like the peanuts and the kaki no tane. And I thought that was just the cutest thing ever.
Yeah.
But the combination can be really powerful, right?
Yeah, for sure. We've got some great comments. Lee says, need this manga for intercultural marriages.
Ah.
And Allison says, totally nodding my head over here. Allison also said, I'd love to read the rice paper ceiling.
Ah, okay. So, oh boy, I can't promise an exact date when I'm going to republish it, but there are used copies available on Amazon for like 1 cent.
So in the U.S., Amazon, or
I think there might be some on Amazon Japan. I know they're on Amazon US. You can get used copies of them.
Great.
So there are floating around out there. I know one time I was teaching a seminar, and someone had brought in the book. And I said, oh, that's so great. Thanks for getting the book. He said, yeah, I got it at the library. They were cleaning out old inventory.
Hey, no, it's still going to be useful for people.
It's still useful information. As I said, I wrote it years ago, but the basic stuff is still the same.
Yeah.
I just need to update it, but in the meantime, get a used one.
Yeah. We've got another comment. Paul says, good point about asking for help. It's definitely one of my weaknesses in business.
It's hard to do because I think, again, it depends on your culture, but, I'm American, and in American culture, we're really told to do things on our own.
Yeah.
And we tend to internalize that, right?
That's a great segue into your conflict resolution style and communication. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Certainly, I'd be happy to. So this is just a sample of one of the slides from the cultural seminars that I teach, to give you a little bit of taste of kind of the stuff that I talk about when teaching about these topics. And so the tool that I like to use is what's called a cultural dimension. And so that's where you have two different opposing cultural values on opposite sides of a scale. And so we have 19 different ones of these that we use in our seminars, depending on the topic. So this one is about communication style. Mm-hmm. You can also have, are you a culture that's very hierarchical or very egalitarian? Are you a culture that's very risk averse or risk seeking? Mm-hmm. Are you a group oriented culture or an individual oriented culture? Are you a culture where time is really precious and you worry about time a lot, or are you at a culture where you don't really care about it and time can be ample for what you need? So there's lots of different cultural value scales. And the key thing about a scale like this is that they're not a value judgment. It's not that left is right and right is bad, it's not that left is good or right is bad or anything like that. Every point on the line, it's what's normal and valid for that culture.
Right.
And so then understanding what those differences are and then coming up with strategies to bridge where there is a gap between you and the other person is what we try and help people with. So these are tools. So this is one about communication conflict resolution style.
All the way in the open confrontation section on the extreme is that Denmark, and then in the other extreme is Thailand. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. Yes. So those would be your very extreme cultures.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
It's very interesting. I went to Thailand for the first time over New Year's, and I was there as a tourist, so I didn't really have work interactions with Thai people, but I was definitely watching the culture. And I went on one, like a half day, kind of like a little bicycle tour through the jungle. And it was very interesting to watch the tour guide. She was a native Thai and spoke excellent English, but at the same time, she definitely matched my kind of understanding of Thai culture from studying cultural things. And the other people on the trip, were asking her lots of questions about Thai culture and kind of pelting her with questions. That again was her job, and people were asking a lot of things. But I noticed that every time someone asked a question that might require a negative answer, or some answer that implied something not so perfect or good about Thai culture. Every time something like that came up, she smiled. It's like cocked her head and smiled. And she had a lovely smile, and she was kind of a charming person, so it definitely worked. But it was so funny to watch that, because that, it definitely matched, being at that far end on this scale. And I think a lot of the people on the tour were kind of like, why is she not answering that question, right?
Just conflict avoidance. That felt
like a very a response that was very in keeping with my understanding of where Thai culture might be on this scale.
That's really interesting.
Yes.
Talking more about telecommuting, because that's a big issue for a lot of people right now. You had this tweet that you did replying to Hikoe Simon.
Oh, Hiko Simon, yes.
About this is really interesting news due to teleworking working better than expected. There is a wave of companies closing their offices in Tokyo or reducing their footprints.
Yeah, I thought that was really amazing. I thought that might happen, but I wasn't expecting to see this kind of news so quickly, right? That there are, but I have seen some Japanese tweeting about, hey, this is working really well and we're comfortable with it. Again, a lot of people hadn't done telecommuting in Japan, and this forced a lot of people to do it. And people are finding that they really like it in some cases. And so evidently some companies are saying, hey, do we even really need an office? Or do we need an office that's as big as it is?
Yeah.
I think another thing that might be happening too is, the economy is kind of not going to be so great for a couple years, and people are looking to cut costs.
Yeah.
Right.
And in terms of equalizing usual disadvantages like gender, or if someone's taking care of elderly family members, or if they're taking care of children, or they have disabilities, there's huge benefits for telecommuting versus having to commute into the office. And
right, exactly.
Right? And for avoiding exposure on the busy trains, also there's that because of coronavirus, right?
Right, exactly. So telecommuting is something that there's already a lot of research that says that it makes people more productive. You're not losing all that time and energy from commuting. You don't have the commuting costs, and also you, as you said, it's much easier for people if they have other responsibilities to create that work-life balance. So there's a lot of reasons why telecommuting is really such a good idea.
Yeah,
it's just that Japanese companies have always been really resistant to it.
Yeah.
But now that they've had to try it, that changes a lot in the whole dynamic, I think.
That's such good news that I was so happy to see that tweet. This is an interesting tweet that we both retweeted. It's a crazy busy graphic, but you pointed out the positive in this. Do you want to introduce this a little bit?
Certainly, yeah. So this is one of the slides that came out yesterday from the Japanese government, talking about their coronavirus strategy going forward. Now, I kind of said, oh, this is really a classic, and a lot of people were kind of dumping on this slide because it's a typical
PowerPoint hell
slide with full of words, right? And it's a complicated chart with lots of writing on it. My clients make things like this all the time. I try and say, that might not work for a Western audience.
Yeah, less is more.
Right. So it's definitely, there's a lot of information packed into this. And so, my first reaction was, oh no, not another Japanese chart like this. On the other hand, thinking about it further, and I tweeted this morning, this is a good chart to be showing to people.
Yeah.
Maybe you could have done it graphically a little bit differently, and I would have maybe drawn it a different way. But the fact that the Japanese government is saying to people, hey, look, there are going to be waves, and we're going to have to deal with this long term, and we're going to have strategies.
Yeah.
And so, they've come up with this new lifestyle type kind of hokey phrase, which again is something that sometimes Japanese organizations like to do. But the basic sort of public communication concept of this, I think, is really good because I think it helps prepare the public.
Definitely.
And I contrast that with my country, and I could go on forever about what a disaster the Trump administration has been in its communication and everything else related to this. But we're not hearing that message coming out of the United States. And people are thinking, okay, now it's done and it's over, and that's just going to make it come back, right?
Yeah,
so
sure.
I really like that the Japanese government is sending this message.
Yeah.
I might tweak the way that they presented it, but the basic thing that they're saying it, I think, is fabulous.
Yeah. No,
it's just people have to hear it. It's reality, right?
Yeah, for sure. And any kind of public service announcement like this, which has a clear indication that it will get better and it will get worse. And this is, people expect the government to take the lead. I think that's
right.
That's a common problem in Japan for many things, right? It's like,
right.
why
do you expect the government to take the lead? So what the government says is so important in Japan for that reason.
Definitely. Now, this was another interesting one, which I hadn't heard. You were talking about vitamin D.
Yes. Evidently, there have been several studies that have come out already where doctors are looking at which patients have the worst outcomes with coronavirus. And there have been several studies already that show that low vitamin D levels are associated with worse outcomes. So people will do studies and all the people in the study who were in the hospital all had low vitamin D.
Wow.
It was a common thing.
Yeah.
And again, it's not just one study. There've been like half a dozen already. So I'm doing a little bit of research right now, trying to look at what's causing the big disparity between countries in terms of their coronavirus outcomes. And so stay tuned for more on that topic.
Yeah, really interesting. And a really easy fix, right? Sit in a sunny window, go for a walk, wear your mask.
Take some vitamin D, eat some liver. I think the thing that's so tricky is everyone's been staying outdoors, so probably getting even less sunshine than normal, right?
Right.
So that makes it worse. But vitamin D deficiency is a really just common issue. And, and it's only recently that doctors have, it's only recently that doctors have started to measure that or consider it important. And I know that I found out it was probably around 2007 or so that a doctor tested me for it, and I had extremely low vitamin D. I had no idea.
Right? Wow.
Yeah, I had no idea. And I think a lot of people have it and don't realize it, right? So it's definitely something, once all this is over, you can go to a doctor. If you've never had your vitamin D checked, I would definitely recommend it.
Okay.
And you don't want to overdose on vitamin D supplement.
Well, you don't want to overdose on any kind of vitamin, basically.
Exactly. But, get some sunshine, maybe take a little bit of a supplement, and eat some egg yolks, eat some liver, eat some fish eggs, eat some mackerel, eat some salmon.
A lot of people think of milk fortified with vitamin D. There are...
That works too. Yeah, that works too.
Ruth, at first she comments, "Love you, Rochelle. Thank you for your positivity and encouragement," from Ruth German. We were talking telework the other day. And Ruth also says, "Are there fruits or vegetables with vitamin D?" I think a simple Google search will get you lots of good
I've
examples.
heard that mushrooms have a high level. Someone mentioned kiwi fruit also. I haven't checked that one, but someone mentioned that.
I love mushrooms, and we have so many wonderful mushrooms in Japan.
That's true. And mushrooms are really good for immunity for other reasons too. So probably a good thing to be putting in your diet right now.
Fantastic. Let's talk a little bit about your seminars, because now that we've been stopping face-to-face stuff, you used to do a lot of person-to-person seminars. You're kind of shifting gears and going to online seminars. You had this tweet about your East Coast US seminar. Do you want to introduce that? I think that's happening soon, right?
Yes, that's next week. And so in Detroit, we regularly do a one-day open seminar of working effectively with Japanese. And so we have kind of a regular kind of group of companies that like to send people to that. Obviously in Detroit, there's lots of interface through the auto industry with Japanese. And we decided to ask the people who were already signed up for our May session, hey, what do you think about just trying to do this online? And people were up for it. And so we still have room for anyone who's in the East Coast US time zone, that's available. And so we're going to be working to make it have all the same content and just as interactive as if you were going to a regular seminar. A lot of webinars are short. They're an hour and a half or something like that. Mm-hmm. But if you do that, you're not really getting the full content. So we're kind of doing this as an experiment to try and get the full content. We realize it's going to be a long time for people to be sitting down, but we want to give this a try and see how it goes.
Wow.
And so we might be doing some other ones like this, as well as some more shorter webinar offerings too.
Yeah, so I'm bringing up a picture now of a typical workshop that you do, a typical seminar. You can see everybody working around tables and everything. So going to the online medium is a huge shift, right?
Yes. Exactly. Yeah. So that's what's so kind of hard for me about the coronavirus, because I thrive in situations like that. Yeah, there were 250 or 300 people in that room, and I was orchestrating them all to do group work, and we had great discussions. I mean, that's a larger one than I normally do, but that's my thing, is I hang out in rooms with people a lot, and so this is really different to not be able to do that and to figure out how can we help people get some of the same learnings in an online context.
Right. You've got a Japanese online event coming up as well. Is that tomorrow, the Thursday gathering?
Tomorrow night, yes, with the Tokyo Venture Cafe. And so that should be really interesting. And that's going to be in Japanese, and it's talking about handling this whole telework thing effectively.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So if you speak Japanese, maybe people can still sign up for that. Is that right?
Yeah, you can definitely still sign up for it, and it's free. So
fantastic. So we've talked about your books. Let's talk a bit more about your articles that you've done. You've done so many great how-to articles as well as your voice articles for the Japan Times. Let's just bring up a few of them if you have any comments to add.
Okay.
These are some of your previous articles. Let's see. How to work with a micromanaging Japanese boss.
Right. That's a topic that often comes up because Japanese bosses love to micromanage, and that's actually one of the reasons that they're resistant to telework. Right. Because a lot of that micromanagement happens in person, or it's easier to just lean over and say, hey, what's going on with this, right?
Right.
And so it's a barrier to telework. But yeah, I find this tends to be very, very annoying from people from more individualistic cultures who are used to working on their own.
Right.
And not having to talk about all the details of what they're doing.
Yeah. You also have another how to, in the Japanese workplace, take training into your own hands.
Yes. That, this is something that I know surprised me when I joined a Japanese organization, that unless you're the freshman joining a company with the crop of people in April of the year, there's often not very much training. And so no one really explained to me how to do my job, and I was sort of on my own, right? And so I think this is an experience that many non-Japanese have in Japanese organizations, where you kind of have to figure out things for your own, on your own, or figure out things for yourself, and find your own learning opportunities and kind of manage your own learning journey.
Right. And then you've got a bunch of articles about it's good to know what you'll expect once you start working for a Japanese company, giving advice to new employees coming over to work for Japanese firms or just working in Japan and in general for a company. I think that's so useful and helpful for people because there are fundamental differences, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, there's really basic differences, and this is really what I've been kind of focusing my career on. There's the communication style, there's the decision-making style, there's different expectations about how a employee and their manager should be communicating. So a huge number of differences that it's really important to get familiar with so that then you can decide how you want to handle them.
Here's another page of your articles asking for a raise in a Japanese company.
Yes, very tricky because that's something that Japanese employees often don't do, right?
Yeah.
And so then when you're non-Japanese and you want to do something that typically isn't done, how do you do it? What's the best way to try?
Yeah, I tried that. Didn't work, but I'm glad I tried. I had a lot of male colleagues who had done it successfully. So maybe there's also a male-female kind of problem there. I'm sure you might bring that up in your article. Japanese companies claim there's a purpose for far-flung job transfers. So that's the article we were talking about before,
Right.
about shuffling your personnel.
Right, exactly.
Getting negative feedback from your boss isn't all bad. So having to take criticism.
That's a really common thing that comes up with people working in Japanese firms, that you get very process-oriented and kind of micromanaging Japanese bosses, and then they'll look at something you did and just be all over it with negative comments. And I find a lot of non-Japanese tend to take that very personally. And so it's important to realize, why is it the Japanese managers do that? And it's actually often a compliment to you.
Right.
Because if they didn't think you could learn, they wouldn't even bother pointing things out.
Yeah, I found that a lot. That was a big adjustment, but I've always only worked in Japan. So I think that would be an adjustment for me with any job, is how to take criticism and activate on criticism in a positive way to improve not only yourself, but improve your communication with how you communicate what you've done to people so they see what you've done.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Last one, nobody's perfect, but an apology really helps at a Japanese company.
Yes, hugely important in Japanese companies and Japanese culture in general. Apologies are really, really key.
Yeah, and I find that, over my career, people are very gracious. If you make a mistake, you apologize about it. Usually they're really good about moving on.
Right.
And forgiving.
Yeah.
And not worrying about it. Some people talk about that with drinking culture, right? If you go out on the after job drinks and you talk about problems, and then nobody brings it up again because it's over. We've dealt with it. You've apologized.
Right. Yes, and then once it's over, people can move past. Yes, but you have to show sincerity.
Yeah.
I think that's what the Japanese really care about. Are you really sincerely regretful? How are you really reflecting on how you could be doing better next time?
Yeah.
And I think if that is there, then there's a lot of flexibility.
Right.
On the other hand, if you look like you're not sincere, or you're not going to try to do something different, or if you look like you're trying to make excuses for yourself or justify what you did, that's going to really, really irritate Japanese and be very counterproductive.
Yeah. I think that's such good advice. Be sincere, no matter where you are in Japan or anywhere. Right. If you make a mistake, own it, as the young people say, and be sincere in your apology and move on, right?
Right, exactly. That's really what you have to do.
This is a great new article, I think, Japan Times. Does Japan's culture explain its low COVID-19 numbers? I think you bring up so many great, not only about COVID, but about the intercultural communication type ideas are also in here. And about stigma in Japanese culture. Right.
Yeah, it's a big thing in Japanese culture, unfortunately, that there's stigma around illness or around a kind of perceived impurity. And so, historically, stigma against people who have tuberculosis or people who have Hansen's disease. We saw a lot of this come up with Fukushima.
Yeah.
Where people who evacuated from Fukushima, the children were then bullied at school and other places, or people didn't want to associate with them. And so there is this kind of thread in Japanese culture, and unfortunately it seems to be coming up with the coronavirus too. And so there have been reports of people being bullied or suffering discrimination for having the disease, or even for being a medical worker who's perceived to be, in contact with people who have the disease. And some of the things are really sort of irrational, like I even saw in an article the other day of someone who couldn't get a job because their wife was a nurse.
No.
Which is like ridiculous. Yeah,
and nurses are having trouble getting their kids in daycare, right?
I know, which is crazy. Yeah, exactly. But there's definitely there's some of that going on, and of course that's not everyone in Japan.
No,
these are a few outlier, outrageous cases, but they do reflect something that is there in the culture.
For sure. And, you know, we, being in Hiroshima, we know this happens even now with hibakusha survivors, that their kids, their grandkids, people are still raising questions. And then even if nobody ever says it to them, they live in fear of stigma.
Right, which has got to be horrible too. You're right. That's a really important example of this whole phenomenon, because again, that just it's from a Western standpoint, it's very difficult to understand that, right?
You bring up an example in the article about coughing in one of your classes.
Oh, yes.
And the comments that you had. Do you want to talk about?
Well, there's this concept of kenko kanri, which is literally managing your health. And so there's this idea that if you get sick, it's your own damn fault because you weren't doing kenko kanri, right? And I had kind of an extenuating circumstance where I had gotten really sick, and I kind of really pushed it. After I was sick, I was coughing for like weeks. There was this terrible thing that was going around the Bay Area at the time. But I was able to pull it together to actually do this seminar that there was no one else to teach it. And then I got this comment, well, you know, you because I still was coughing a bit during the seminar. Well, you know, you should be taking better care of your health. And like I was that one personally just really bothered me because actually it bothered me a lot because actually my sister had passed away suddenly at the end of December.
Yeah.
And then in January I got really sick, which is not surprising. There was this terrible thing going on, but I was also depressed. And so then I was able to like get over this, and like did the seminar that I had to do, and I did it really well even though I was coughing. And then to get this comment like, oh, you should take better care of yourself. And I'm like, you don't even know, right? And of course, this person couldn't know, but I guess one of the really important things that I try and teach when I'm talking about culture, and I just think it's a good rule in general, is you never know what's going on with other people.
Exactly, yeah.
You don't know what their experience has been, what's been happening. Of course, this guy wrote the comment, there's no way he could have known that, like, my sister died and I was upset and then got sick. But you never know, and so it's really important to be careful about being judgmental.
Definitely,
right?
Definitely.
Yeah.
What is the phrase? You walk in somebody's shoes before you judge them, right?
Exactly. And the thing about culture is that you can't see it, and you don't know what people's experiences are.
Yeah.
Or you also don't know. A lot of people have disabilities that are not visible.
Right.
You know, that they could have dyslexia, they could have learning disabilities, or another example, I have it's very, very slight, and it's only for very specific situations, but I have, it's called central auditory processing disorder, and I have a very, very mild case of it that's very specific, but if I'm in a place where there are lots of noises that are competing with each other and echoing off walls, I have trouble hearing, and so I can hear it, but my brain has trouble processing. I tend to shut down. So I hate going to loud bars. Right. Because I withdraw and I'm sort of not functional. And again, it's very specific case. There are people who have this, who have it in life in general, and can't go to a class and take notes because it's hard. I don't have anything like that, but I have it in that situation. And so one thing that sometimes happens to me is if I'm in an American airport, even sometimes Japanese ones, where there's all these announcements, I have trouble dealing with it, and I tend to block it out. And there's been a couple times in the U.S. where I've almost missed a plane because, like, they announced the gate changed, and amid the cacophony of other things, I kind of didn't catch it. And I didn't go to the right place, or I didn't get up or do what I should have. And one time...
I hate noise pollution at airports. I cannot relax. Yeah.
Right. And one time, like, one of the airline staff, like, started scolding me.
No.
And I'm like, well, it might not be visible, but I actually have a disability here, right?
But in Japanese culture, I don't get it, because there's, like you've had that comment. I think a lot of us have had comments, you need to take better care of yourself. But on the other extreme, you've got people saying, oh my gosh, he looks awful. He's been working at the office every night until midnight. Isn't he amazing? And encouraging the people trying to kill themselves for the company. But you have to take care of yourself. What's your problem? It's like, what? You can't win either way.
Well, you can't really win, right? There is this kind of expectation. Well, I remember a friend of mine, she had studied Japanese starting in high school, and she would participated in this Japan-US student conference where they get together and do projects. And she told me her first kind of culture shock, she's American, her first culture shock about Japan was that she learned the word tawarata. So one of the students on one of the groups had tawarata, which means to like faint or pass out or whatever. And she was like, what? And evidently the gal had worked really, really late until the night, and like it had affected her physically and had to be taken to the infirmary. And she was like, why would you even do that? This is just some student group that we're on. Like, why would you work yourself to the point where you pass out? Yeah. And she just said that was for her, at this point she was a college student. And encountering that someone would do that for her was just a huge shock.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. And I'm sure, it's not only Japan, right? There's people who overwork themselves and are, upheld for it in American companies.
Well, this is true. Yes. And there is a whole issue about this in a lot of countries, right?
Yeah.
And what I always say is I feel like that whole, at least in the United States, work yourself to death kind of thing is a relatively small segment of the population. It's those people who work for consulting firms or work on Wall Street. It's people who went to Ivy League schools and have these really high-paid jobs. There's this whole culture of overwork. And I always feel like a lot of those issues of kind of elite culture in the U.S. are issues that like a really broad swath of the Japanese population has. It's like those, what we see in one small group in the U.S. is a whole large group of people in Japan. Right. Who have that expectation or that culture that's come about. So it's not like we don't have it in the U.S., but it's more limited to a certain number of people.
And I think
it's a good thing, but it's just a smaller number.
I think we can apply it back to telework too. That a lot of people, now that they're allowed to work from home or expected to work from home, are finding it hard to turn off work. That suddenly they're like, oh, what? I'm working all the time now because there is no break.
And that's happening in other countries too during this corona crisis, not just Japan, but Japanese are definitely having it. And that is just an issue with telework. It is really important to try and make a schedule for yourself.
Yeah.
Because if you're working in the same place that you're living, it's like your work is always beckoning.
Yeah.
One thing I do is I have it here. I have very nice Japanese furoshiki. And what I do is when I am done with work for the day, I put it over the laptop. Okay.
That's good. That's a good way.
Right? Yeah, because I do this thing where I don't turn my laptop off. I leave it on.
Yeah.
On the rest of my computer consultants. So I just put this over it, right? And it takes a nap. I have two computers that's going on that one.
We have a question from Maido. He says, did Japan always have this work ethic, or is it post-World War II phenomena? What do you think?
Oh, that is a very good question.
The Edo era is all about working, but the love of finding industry and finding
right. It's Edo period. I think of loyalty, right? And I also think of Edo, kind of pre-war or at least Edo period. I mean, your profession or your livelihood was your life, right? And there wasn't really a border, and that's just kind of what you did, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's
The work to live or live to work conundrum,
right? But it's just sort of who you were, right? Yeah. Right. It's nice. Like if you were a samurai, like it's not like it stopped at 5 o'clock, right?
Right. Yeah. That's your life.
Being a samurai didn't ever end, right? Mm-hmm. Or being whatever it was you were. So I think it was a little different, and that again in that way probably different in other societies too. It's a good question to when it dates from. I can't give a specific answer. I'd like to look into that, though. It's a good question.
But your advice about keeping a schedule or covering your laptop, any other advice for teleworkers in Japan or anywhere?
Well, I think the schedule thing is really, really important. I think it's important to try and do something as a ritual when you're starting work and a ritual when you're ending work. So, for example, I try to have a kind of a set things I do when I'm starting to work. And that involves, for my case, getting either some coffee or some water, hot water to drink, and sitting down and kind of getting situated. But I could have kind of steps that I go through, and I have steps that I do, the first things I do when I start my work. So kind of creating a ritual is good.
Nice.
You know what I found recently that just a few days ago that I really like? It's a thing called brain.fm. Mm-hmm. And you get music that especially entrains your brain for focusing. And it's a thing you get. It's a subscription. It's like 500 yen a month or something like that.
I do that on YouTube sometimes. You search for concentration music.
Okay, there you go. That would be a free way to do it. Okay,
and you have this nice, like it's ambient music that plays in your ear.
Right. In this specific one, they have a zillion research studies on their site where it's proven that whatever they do with the music actually does entrain your brain. And I find it's really helpful because, again, if I put that on, okay, now is the time to focus, right?
Yeah, that's great. That's a very good tip. I think the audio influence is definitely big on concentration, especially while you're at a computer.
Right, exactly. And you're not in the workplace that you're used to being in. I know a lot of people really like that coffee shop kind of atmosphere. There was a little bit of noise in the background, right? So I think on YouTube there's even coffee shop noise videos that you can find too, right?
Yeah. So we have one final question, and then I think we'll stop the broadcast. Just over an hour now. So much great advice and insight so far, Rochelle. Thank you so much. This is a comment from Prasanna. Do you see a considerable change in the attitudes of the younger generation more attuned to Western way of working? This different work ethic might bring friction in the workplace dominated by old generation bosses. What is your advice for the young generation to wade through this corporate culture successfully?
Yes, I think that is definitely going on. I think in Japan we see a really big culture gap and style gap between, and I think it's the biggest differences between the people who are over 50 and the people who are under 30, right? That they've grown up in a different cultural milieu. There's different influences. People over 50 tend to be, I'm just going to tell you the stream seems to be offline.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I'm still live. It might be one of the channels.
Okay, one of the channels. Okay, I'm just telling you because I've got it on my iPad here and it says it stopped. Okay. Anyways, I'm sorry. So also for the people over 50, their mind they grew up in the bubble period.
Right.
When Japan was expanding and doing great, and the way that things are done then have become kind of what they had a successful experience with when they were younger. So that's still kind of set in their head.
Right.
So it's a big challenge. And so if you're a younger person, it's realizing, hey, this is a different culture. And what seems obvious to me is not obvious to these other people. And learn what is their culture and what do you need to convince them.
Right.
Rather than, I think it's really easy, just like with national cultures, with generational cultures, it's really easy to put a negative label on it.
Right.
And just say, the thing that people say in Japanese, it's oji-san, it's those old guys. But I really don't like the word oji-san the way it's used, because again, it's a stereotypical negative label. And just because someone's over 50 doesn't mean that they have an old-fashioned way of thinking. You shouldn't assume that.
Yeah.
But if there are differences in approach, understand what those are as if you were dealing with a different national culture.
Yeah. And remember that there are individuals within businesses as well, right? Like even though generally that's true, you're dealing with a boss who has an individual characteristic.
Exactly.
Right.
And they might not fit their generational stereotype at all.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You have to deal with people as individual people. And it's kind of like what I was saying before. Don't make assumptions.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And give people benefit of the doubt. Be honest, be authentic.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Rochelle. So much great insights, so much great information. At the bottom of the screen right now, we can see your tweets. So please follow Rochelle on Twitter in English or Japanese. And she's got online seminars in English and Japanese coming up soon. So check that out. Right. Also, we look forward to your next great article on the Japan Times. So much great insight about working in Japan. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Really great talking with you today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. And this will appear on YouTube in its permanent home. And definitely watch and repeat and comment there. Thank you so much. Have a good day,
great.
everyone.
Okay, thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.